Word travels even when bodies cannot. By the time planters reached the swamp, the story had already outpaced them. They found no camp, only footprints leading deeper into mud and silence. But the parishes whispered. They whispered in kitchens, in quarters, in markets. The Lion of Louisiana. Some said he killed 8 men. Others said he simply disappeared into the rain. The details changed, but the meaning stayed. Fear could bleed. The white newspapers called him a brute. Sermons condemned him as a demon, a warning against disobedient flesh. Yet, among the enslaved, his name became code. Lion's weather, they would say when a storm gathered, meaning, tonight, the world shifts a little closer to justice. Years later, long after the sugar mills rusted and the overseers' sons took safer jobs in the city, a boy in New Orleans carried a small red thread bag in his pocket. His grandmother had given it to him with a whisper, for luck and for remembering. No one said the lion's name aloud anymore, but his silence lived on in that thread, in that rhythm, in the unspoken defiance passed through generations. Freedom came in fragments, first rumors, then proclamations, then papers read in disbelief. But paper freedom and lived freedom are not the same. The lion's story survived because it had been written not on parchment, but in practice. It taught that resistance need not announce itself. It can live in the quiet choice not to kneel, the simple act of standing one day longer than the world expects. When emancipation finally came, men who had never met him still spoke of the night the mill stopped. They said that was the moment the world's gears began to turn in a new direction. The arithmetic of power had changed, bone for bone, breath for breath, will for will. In the decades that followed, Louisiana built monuments for generals and planters, but none for the lion. Stone would have been too small a language for him anyway. His monument was motion, every person who refused to bow, every worker who demanded a name, every song sung in defiance that began low and rose like thunder. And sometimes, when rain sweeps across the bayou and the wind carries the scent of cane and ash, people still say the same thing. The lion is walking again. Not as a man this time, but as a memory that corrects the record. He never sought glory, he sought equilibrium. And in the end, that is the truest form of victory, the moment when the world finally learns what he proved in the sugar mill. That bones, like systems, will break when pressure is finally returned. His story is not a legend, it is an equation. Endurance plus will equals change. And so long as someone remembers that math, the roar of the lion will never fade from the swamps of Louisiana. The swamp was not mercy, it was mathematics. Every step had to be earned. The lion knew this as he led the others through the bayou that night, rain still falling like a curtain drawn to hide them from pursuit. Cypress trees rose like cathedral columns. Their roots, tangled and ancient, whispered the names of those who had fled before. The air was heavy with mud and insects, but freedom has its own kind of oxygen. He did not march them in lines or bark orders. He moved like the tide, slow, deliberate, knowing that retreat and advance were the same motion in water. The smallest child he carried on his shoulders, her face pressed against the red thread charm tied now to his neck. The others followed, barefoot and breathless. The rhythm of their fear softened by the swamp's chorus of frogs and rain. Behind them, dogs bayed faintly in the distance, their cries warped by thunder. The patrols would come, of course, they always did. But the swamp was a teacher that punished arrogance. It swallowed hoofprints, silenced footsteps, and turned every scent into mist. Here, the lion was no fugitive. He was fluent. Days bled into nights. Hunger became their compass, thirst their calendar. They learned to boil cattails for food, to follow fireflies toward drier ground, to listen for the sudden stillness that warned of snakes or men. The lion taught them how to move when afraid, not faster, but quieter. Panic made noise. Purpose made progress. When at last the trees opened to higher ground, they found what the law said could not exist: a camp of people who had escaped long before. Men and women who had built lives in secrecy, carving freedom from wilderness. The Maroons welcomed them not with celebration, but with understanding. No one asked questions. Survival was the only passport required. For the first time, the lion slept without chains. The night sounds were still strange, but they were honest. The frogs did not lie, the wind did not threaten, the water did not command. In the mornings, he worked alongside the others, repairing roofs, carving traps, teaching children to weave ropes and nets. He laughed once, quietly, as a boy mimicked his heavy walk and called him Big Water. Freedom, he realized, was not the absence of danger, it was the presence of choice. The swamp did not promise safety, but it offered equality. All who entered obeyed the same law. He began to teach what he had learned, the language of patience, the art of reading silence, the wisdom of waiting for the right storm. Water never fights, he told them. It only finds another way. The Maroons built a life around that lesson. They survived patrols, floods, and hunger, because they remembered what the lion had proven. No system, no chain, no overseer can hold what refuses to stay still. And when the rains returned, thick and unending, some swore they heard a low roar in the distance, not of rage, but of warning. Carried in the thunder, rain came down in sheets that swallowed lantern light. The cane leaves hissed, bent low under water, and even the hounds retreated to shelter. It was the kind of night no man expected witnesses. The overseer still came drunk, shouting orders into the downpour, his whip coiled like a promise. Inside the sugar house, steam hung thick. The men worked slower, their eyes darting between the overseer and the lion, who stood at the wheel, bare chest gleaming like wet bronze. The lash cracked once too close to the boy who had stumbled weeks before. That was the moment the world exhaled differently. The lion stepped into the circle of light. He caught the whip mid-air, the leather twisting in his fist. The overseer blinked, uncertain whether he'd seen defiance or magic. When the lion pulled, it wasn't rage, it was gravity, correcting itself. The overseer stumbled forward. The whip fell. What followed wasn't battle, but inevitability. Bones break like laws, they resist until they don't. The sound was dull, final. The overseer's body hit the floorboards with a weight history couldn't ignore. Around them, men froze. No one screamed. The mill's great flywheel slowed, then stopped, the hiss of steam collapsing into silence. Outside, lightning flashed white through the gaps in the wall, carving the moment into memory. The lion didn't speak, he simply stood, breathing steady, his eyes sweeping across faces, some wide with terror, others lit with recognition. The silence was heavier than any roar. It was understanding passing from one body to another. Fear could be broken too. Then he turned, cut the lantern's wick with a knife, and darkness took the room. No one moved for what felt like years. When thunder rolled again, he was gone. By dawn, the mill stood still. The fire had died in the furnaces, the kettles cooled, and the gears dripped condensation like sweat. The overseer's cabin was empty, the lash missing. The quarter awoke to a strange quiet, the kind that felt like the pause between two eras. The planters called it revolt. The men who lived it called it breathing. The lion had not killed out of fury, but out of necessity. The balance had demanded its due. The rain washed the blood into the earth, and by sunrise, even that had disappeared. But the ground remembers, and so did every man who had watched that whip fall limp in the lion's hand. That morning, no orders were given, and none were obeyed. The mill did not scream. The fields did not sing. The world had stopped spinning just long enough for everyone to understand what it meant when strength finally refused to kneel. Preparation is courage's quieter brother, the one history forgets because it doesn't bleed. The lion began his with silence. He mapped the plantation in his mind the way a surveyor charts rivers, where they bend, where they flood, where they hide. Every creak of the gate, every groan of a board, every cough from the overseer's cabin became part of a rhythm he could play like a drum. He studied the dogs first. Their patrols were loyal but predictable. He learned that on humid nights, when thunder rolled far off, their ears dulled. When rain thickened, their scent failed. Then the lanterns, each one burned for precisely 2 hours on a single fill. He timed them with the patience of a priest, watching oil thin to memory. When the wick dimmed, so did the overseer's vigilance. He traded small favors among the enslaved. An extra hour at the mill for a few nails, a repaired handle for a whispered rumor. He gathered what he needed not for war but for precision: rope braided from old feed sacks, a wedge carved from the handle of a broken shovel, scraps of iron flattened beneath wagon wheels. Tools not to destroy, but to interrupt. The midwife taught him the difference between sleeping and finally asleep, the shift in breathing, the drop of the shoulder, the surrender of muscle. The carter showed him which gate closed only because it believed it did, its pin rusted halfway through. He stored water in hollow logs near the swamp, hidden from patrol eyes. Each act small enough to be invisible, each essential to something larger. He practiced breathing as discipline, not prayer. How long could the lungs hold when rage wanted release? Longer, he learned, always longer. Rage burns fast, patience survives. And survival was the foundation of all justice. He began to think of the plan not as rebellion, but as correction, a balancing of scales long bent out of shape. He spoke to no one about it. Even trust was a luxury too expensive for the enslaved. Yet, those closest to him felt the tightening of the air, the way storms hum before breaking. At dusk, he stood beneath the same oak where men had once been whipped. He looked up through the branches and thought of those who had endured before him, not saints, just survivors who passed endurance like inheritance. The wind moved through the leaves, whispering in a language older than fear. He understood enough to answer, "I am ready." When he returned to his cabin, he checked the rope one last time, tied the charm around his wrist instead of his neck, and waited for thunder. The world, he decided, had already given him every warning. What remained was only arithmetic, action and consequence, cause and return. The plantation's cruelty rarely surprised him anymore, until the day the master sold a nursing woman to pay off a gambling debt. The sale was conducted with the same casual tone used to order more barrels. The woman's child wailed until his voice cracked. And then there was only the faint sound of the overseer's pen scratching across paper. "Business," they said. That night, the quarters were quieter than any sermon. The lion sat outside, watching the empty cradle the woman had left behind. It still smelled faintly of milk and cedar. He lifted it and carried it to the sugar house, setting it beside the great flywheel that turned the mill. Then, without a word, he walked away. No one needed to ask what it meant. A cradle without a child, placed before the engine that devoured men, it was a message no whip could erase. The next morning, he worked as usual. The overseer barked orders, the same routine that had governed 1,000 days before. But something invisible had shifted. The lion's silence had changed timbre from obedience to warning. The men around him felt it. Even the overseer hesitated when his voice rose. It meant something immovable in return. That evening, when the mill quieted, he placed his hand on the flywheel again. The vibration thrummed through his bones, a deep, mechanical heartbeat. He realized he and the machine were kin, both built to carry, both breaking under the weight of others' appetites. But unlike the machine, he could choose when to stop turning. He didn't think of himself as savior or martyr. He thought of balance. For every cruelty, a counterweight. For every theft, a reckoning. The world was not written only in scripture or law, it was also written in the physics of endurance. Later that week, when a whip cracked near a mother's child, something in him tore loose, not in anger, but in necessity. His voice, long buried under commands, came out not as words, but as a sound the swamp would remember. A deep, guttural roar that silenced even the kettles. The overseer froze, as if time itself had missed a step. It wasn't a fight yet, just the first vibration of a storm that had waited 15 years to be born. That night, when the quarters slept, the lion lay awake, listening to the rain beat against the tin roof. It sounded like chains breaking, link by link, softened by distance, but certain in rhythm. He touched the charm under his shirt, closed his eyes, and whispered not a prayer, but a truth he could finally believe. The will to stand is older than fear. New Orleans on a Sunday was another kind of sermon, one the planters tried to silence but never could. Down at Congo Square, the air pulsed with drums that spoke older than English, older than the chains themselves. Dancers moved in circles wide as forgiveness, bare feet marking a language remembered through rhythm. For the lion, it was the first time in years he had seen joy not borrowed from suffering. He stood at the edge, silent, unsure if he was spectator or ghost. An old woman selling pralines caught his eye. Her shawl was a riot of color against the drab Sunday coats around her. When he reached for a sweet, she pressed something else into his palm, a tiny pouch tied with red thread, the smell of bay leaf and salt faint beneath the sugar. "For luck," she said, her voice like gravel under rain. "Or for remembering." He didn't believe in charms the way preachers believed in scripture. Yet, when his calloused fingers closed around the pouch, something in him loosened. He hadn't touched anything freely given in years. The smallness of it felt sacred. He tied it under his shirt, near his heart, where the overseer's eyes could not reach. Back at the plantation, he kept hearing the drums. Their echo followed the rhythm of the cane knives, the creak of wagons, the wheeze of the boilers. He began to hum low while he worked, a sound like breath disguised as prayer. Others joined, then the old midwife, her cracked voice carrying something that felt like defiance but sounded like lullaby. For the first time, the quarters had a song not taught by sorrow. He didn't think of rebellion then. Hope was not yet a weapon. It was a medicine, taken carefully in small doses so the spirit didn't overdose on dreaming. Still, he began to notice how men straightened their backs when the song began, how women's hands moved quicker, lighter, as if work no longer owned them completely. The lion realized that strength, when shared quietly, could heal instead of only resist. He repaired tools that others had given up on, fixed a broken wheel for the carter, built a cradle for the childless woman whose arms still remembered rocking. In these small acts, he was not a giant or a myth, he was a man, whole and unmeasured. Every night, before sleep, he untied the red thread charm and pressed it to his lips. He didn't pray, not exactly. He simply listened to the frogs, to the hiss of the mill cooling, to the steady thump of his own heart that refused to tire. He understood then that hope was not softness. It was a kind of endurance sharper than steel. It did not wait for miracles, it prepared for them. And though he did not yet know it, the woman's small gift would outlast every chain in Louisiana. Some men are not born cruel, they become instruments. The overseer was such a man, molded by routine, by authority, by the satisfaction of obedience disguised as duty. His whip was not just a tool, it was his language. It hissed before it spoke, and the plantation knew the dialect well. He carried it coiled at his side, a serpent of control, striking when conversation failed. The lion had seen lashes before, but this man's hand was steady, his enjoyment disciplined. He struck not in rage but in rhythm, turning pain into policy. The others feared him for his predictability. It meant there was no pleading, no chance of mercy. The lion feared something else, how easily cruelty could become the structure of a man's life. He learned to endure, but not to accept. He discovered how to take the blow sideways, to let the lash glide instead of bite. The trick was not to fight the strike, but to let it pass through without giving it what it wanted reaction. The overseer mistook that stillness for submission, and in that misreading lay his eventual ruin. Once, during a storm, a young boy barely 12 dropped a pail when thunder cracked. The whip came down faster than lightning. The boy screamed, a sound so high it seemed to tear the air itself. The lion stepped forward, catching the child before he fell. The overseer laughed. "Teach him to hold tighter next time." That laughter stuck in the lion's chest like a thorn. It wasn't rage yet. Rage is too immediate. What grew inside him was colder, heavier, a patience with teeth. The overseer had a pattern. Bottle first, patrol after. By the time the lantern's flame began to sway in his hand, his cruelty had turned sloppy. The lion watched, memorizing. A man who believes he's feared becomes predictable. A man predictable becomes vulnerable. Each crack of the whip was an addition to a silent account, a ledger that would one day be balanced. But he told no one of his thoughts. Words, he knew, were seeds that might fall into the wrong soil. He waited, he worked, he watched. In the evenings, when the overseer disappeared into his cabin, the lion would walk to the edge of the swamp. Frogs sang, owls stirred, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, immense, and realized they had always been his only language. The overseer spoke with the whip. One day, he would answer with something older than words. He turned toward the quarters, rain beginning to fall. The sound of water striking cane leaves was sharp and clean, like the rehearsal of an ending. Something had shifted, not a plan yet, but the alignment of the world, subtle and irreversible, like a tide deciding which way it will pull come morning. Sunday on the plantation was not rest. It was theater. The planters came in, pressed linen, wives shaded under parasols, children licking molasses from their fingers. They came to see the giant, their prize, their novelty, the man they called the lion. He was told to lift, to pull, to bend iron bars for their amusement. They wagered over how many barrels he could raise, laughed when his sweat dripped into the dust, clapped when his muscles trembled just enough to prove he was still human. They called it entertainment. He called it inventory of humiliation, of witnesses, of what power looked like when it mistook itself for safety. He never spoke during these performances. Words would have spoiled the illusion that he was less than them. So he played the part, the obedient marvel, the living proof of their dominion. Every cheer was a nail driven into the coffin of his dignity, and yet, he smiled. Smiling was easier than bleeding. In the corners of his mind, he kept count of faces. He marked who bet against him, who laughed the loudest, who flinched when he looked directly at them. Memory, for a man without freedom, was both armor and weapon. The weight he carried was not only physical, it was the crushing paradox of being praised for endurance in a world that demanded his submission. He began to understand that they loved his strength precisely because it reassured them that no matter how strong he was, he still belonged to them. They wanted to believe that power could be owned, like land or cattle. That illusion was their comfort and his leash. But the lion had learned something subtler than rebellion. He learned patience. He learned how arrogance breeds blindness, how routine dulls vigilance. He practiced the small art of observation. Which overseer favored whiskey before patrol? Which padlock had a missing tooth? Which dog slept nearest the kitchen? He learned to make himself invisible in plain sight, to let the planters see what they wanted, a beast who obeyed. Behind that mask, a mind measured and recorded. After the crowds left, the overseer would sometimes linger, half drunk on victory and rum. "You're lucky, boy," he'd say. "You got gifts. The Lord made you strong for a reason." The lion would nod. He knew the overseer believed the same Lord had made chains for men like him. He also knew that the Lord of the overseer's sermons and the God of his grandmother's songs were not the same deity. His God spoke through storms and silence, through the pulse that refused to slow even after the whip. That night, as he lay on the dirt floor of the quarters, his back stiff from the show, he thought about the word strong. Here, it was a compliment poisoned into a curse. To be strong was to be used. To be useful was to be trapped. He fell asleep with one quiet vow forming like a seed in his chest. One day, strength would mean something different. It would mean refusal. He arrived in New Orleans not as a traveler but as cargo, 14 years old, barefoot, and already bearing the shoulders of a man twice his age. His Wolof name was not written down. The clerk reshaped it into something that fit neatly on a bill of sale. The buyers along the levee preferred their merchandise labeled, "Not Remembered." They spoke in prices and weights, not origins. The boy listened and understood that in this new world, the only language worth learning was the one that could keep you alive. The auction yard smelled of salt and sugar. Behind him, the river carried whispers of Africa in the wind. Ahead, the sound of iron hoops on barrels marked the rhythm of Louisiana commerce. "Strong stock," someone said, and a hand struck his back to prove it. He didn't flinch. That single act, standing still, was the first defiance they never noticed. His days began before light, before even the roosters of the bayou found their courage. He hauled cane and loaded barrels until sweat stung his eyes like brine. When he grew tired, he thought of the men who once fished beside his father on the Senegal River, who believed the body was a tool, not a cage. That thought was dangerous comfort. It taught him that strength could belong to him, not to those who claimed to own it. The quarters were a world within a world. Here, laughter survived in pieces, stitched together over stew pots and whispered songs. Here, names lost on paper found new form and sound. They called him Lion, not because of his size, though he grew to fill every doorway, but because of the quiet warning in his eyes. He moved differently, as if every gesture carried a hidden weight of judgment. Men respected him. Women nodded when he passed. Children followed at a distance, as though watching a creature from story. He was not immune to despair. Nights stretched long on the cane fields, the air heavy with the scent of rot and fire. But when others broke, he lifted. When others were struck, he stepped closer. That was how he learned leadership without ever being taught it by standing where no one else dared remain upright. He had no schooling, yet he counted. Not in coins or measures, but in what the fields took. One man's hand, another's sight, a mother's will, numbers written in flesh. He began to keep a different kind of ledger, one not in ink, but in memory. Every injustice, every humiliation, every name. He held them close, not for revenge, but because remembering was the only freedom left to those denied it. By the time he reached 20, the Lion was no longer a boy. He was a fact, part of the machinery that ground sugar into profit. Yet even machines hum with something living inside. In the echo of the mill, he learned to tell which sounds came from iron and which from the souls of men being bent. The two were not so different. Both strained, both broke, both waited for someone strong enough to resist the turn. It was a night swollen with thunder and sugar smoke, October 1854, Bayou La Fourche. Inside the cane mill, where sweat and steam blurred faces into ghosts, a man the size of a freight wagon paused mid-shift and refused an order. For 15 years, he had been muscle without name, lifting what broke others, silent as a storm, not yet chosen to strike. But that night, the overseer's lash met a different law. By dawn, 8 white men were gone, and the fields whispered his new title, the Lion of Louisiana. Power had changed hands, and history, for once, had flinched first.